I want to welcome you to our class today. This is the class for April the 30th. I'm having to encode the class early because I will be at my son's graduation today. And so we are not going to be in the classroom with you or in the chat room. And you will be able to view it at the proper time, though. Would remind you that your paper for on suffering is due today, and if you're going to be late with that, let me know. I will accept it, but might count off a little bit. We were in 2 Peter. We'd gone through the first chapter and had gotten into the second chapter. The second chapter is basically a warning against false teachers. And we see at the very first part of verse 1 how that their presence is assured. They will be around. They always have been. They always will be. Then he describes their nature in the latter part of verse 1 through the first part of verse 3, and how that they work in coming in secretly among you, bringing in damnable heresies or doctrines, denying the Lord that bought us. Their doctrines lead to destruction, and many sadly will be led astray, but and how that they are making merchandise of the brethren. Now then, in the latter part of verse 3 through verse 9, their destruction is pronounced, and that was the section we were dealing with as our time went out last week. And I want to go back and read those verses, and then we will go through them. He says, starting at the first part of verse 3, even though our discussion really as to their destruction pronounced deals with the latter part of verse 3 through verse 9. But it says, and through covetousness shall they with feigned words make merchandise of you, whose judgment now of a long time lingereth not, and their damnation slumbereth not. For if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down into hell, or down to hell, and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment, and spared not the old world, but saved Noah, the eighth person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly, and turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them with an overthrow, making them an example unto those that should live ungodly, and delivered just Lot, vexed with the filthy conversation of the wicked. For that righteous man dwelling among them, and seeing and hearing, vexed his righteous soul from day to day with their unlawful deeds. The Lord knoweth how to deliver the godly out of temptation, and to reserve the just unto the day of judgment to be punished. We see, as we start this, that their judgment is near, their destruction is near, and then he sets forth three examples of judgment. First, the angels that were sin were cast down to Tartarus, and not hell, as the King James has. It's not the Greek word Gehenna, which would be actually hell. It's not the Greek word Hades, which is translated by hell in the King James. It would deal with the unseen realm or unseen world. It is that location where the spirit resides after death. It is made up of two compartments, area which we refer to as Abraham's bosom or paradise. It is where those who have been righteous are blessed by God. Then there is that other compartment which we call Tartarus, and we get that from the Greek word that's translated hell here, Tatar Usu. It is that compartment of Hades, where those souls who were unrighteous are going to be punished throughout that time. It is Hades, both compartments, is without the body, and it is a temporary place until the second coming. And at the second coming, there will be the resurrection of the body and the passing of sentence or judgment, and then a going into that eternal abode with a combination of an immortal body and our spirits with it. Now then, these angels that sin, and we really don't know any details about it, they were cast down to Tartarus and delivered into chains of darkness to be reserved in the judgment. The second example is the antediluvian world. While God saved Noah and the 8 with him, or 8 individuals total, he destroyed the antediluvian world because of their ungodliness. And that is, of course, he brought the flood upon the world of those ungodly people, Genesis the 6th, 7th, and 8th chapters. That brings us to verse 6, and that is the third illustration or example of judgment would be Sodom and Gomorrah, that he turned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes. He condemned them. Thus, Sodom and Gomorrah serve as an example of those who live ungodly. The homosexuality is the specific sin that is set forth for Sodom and Gomorrah, along with the cities of the plain. And you will no doubt recall the story from Genesis the 18th and 19th chapter, how that Abraham pled for that city, the righteous there, and talked to God, and God said if there are only 10 righteous souls, he would spare the city, but that could not be found. But he still delivered just Lot. And that, of course, would certainly lend itself to a discussion of the fact of Lot's poor decision in choosing that which looked good for his flocks, and as a result, his soul, though, was vexed daily. Notice that in verse 8, that here's this righteous man dwelling among them, yet his righteous soul was vexed. Literally, that word is tormented day and night because of their sinfulness, because of their homosexuality. One thing that it's important to notice here, that it does not matter. And here we don't know how many people lived in Sodom, Gomorrah, and the cities of the plain. But no doubt there were numerous, those were larger cities in that day, numerous people lived there. And yet, here's Lot. And Lot was able to remain faithful in spite of the unrighteousness of all of the people that surrounded him. And that gives us comfort, knowing that likewise we can live righteous even in an unrighteous world. And Lot was a good illustration of that. But here's individuals who were tormenting Lot because of the poor decision that Lot made earlier in life. We need to be careful about the decisions that we make. But God delivered just Lot. He destroyed those cities because of their unrighteousness. And then verse 9 kind of sums up this section, that God knows how to deliver the godly, and God knows how to punish the wicked. He does both. And you might even start out with the aspect God knows. The Lord knows. He knows how to deliver the godly. God knows how to punish the wicked, and he will do such. He will do both of those, and we see those illustrations here. Now then, in verses 10 through verse 19, we have some further descriptions of these false teachers. Peter writes, "But chiefly them that walk after the flesh in the lust of uncleanness and despise government. Presumptuous are they, self-willed. They are not afraid to speak evil of dignities. Whereas angels, which are greater in power and might, bring not a railing accusation against them before the Lord. But these, as natural brute beasts, made to be taken and destroyed, speak evil of things that they understand not, and shall utterly perish in their own corruption, and shall receive the reward of unrighteousness, as they that count it pleasure to riot in the daytime. Spots they are, and blemishes, sporting themselves with their own deceivings, while they feast with you, having eyes full of adultery that cannot cease from sin, beguiling unstable souls. A heart they have exercised with covetous practices. Cursed children, which have forsaken the right way and gone astray, following the way of Balaam, the son of Bosor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness, but was rebuked for his iniquity. The dumb ass, speaking with man's voice, forbade the madness of the prophet. These are wells without water, clouds that are carried with a tempest, to whom the mist of darkness is reserved forever. For when they speak great swelling words of vanity, they allure through the lust of the flesh, through much wantonness, that those that were clean escaped from them who lived in error. While they promise them liberty, they themselves are the servants of corruption. For of whom a man is overcome, of the same is he brought in bondage." So here is a lengthy section describing these false teachers that were among them. And he first sets forth the aspect that they walk after the flesh and despise governments. The word governments that's found there in verse 10 is literally despise dominions. And so it would deal with anyone who has authority. It might remind us of the time that we went through, the 60s, where there was the anti-establishment type of attitude. Well, that's this type of attitude, a despising of dominions, a despising of those who are in authority. And these individuals are presumptuous. They take it upon themselves to do what they want to. They're not going to be controlled by anyone, and thus they are self-willed. They're going to do what they want. Forget about anyone else. Forget about what God says, what the government might say, what anyone in authority might say. And again, it describes very well that period of the 60s that we went through, 1960s, of that type of a anti-establishment, anti-authority type of period that we went through. The only difference is, or one of the main differences, Peter is dealing with those who were at one time members of the Lord's church. They were brethren, and they were among the brethren, and doing these things. Then he says that they speak evil, and that's the word blaspheme. And they blaspheme dignities. The word dignities would literally is glories. So they speak evil of those in authority. They blaspheme those in authority. And then he makes comparison in relationship to angels. Not even angels will do that. And yet here's these men who will speak evil of these in authority. And he mentions angels which are greater in power and might. They won't bring a railing accusation against them, but these men will. How much presumptuousness is found in these statements in relationship to these individuals. He then says that they are brute beasts, and they have, in other words, no more self-control than a wild animal. And notice, if you just notice the comparisons. They are brute beast, and then go down, they understand not. They don't understand. Why? Because they are brute beast. And then go back to, they speak evil. They speak evil because they don't understand. If they understood, then they might not act that way. But these individuals have no self-control. They're like wild animals out there who are speaking evil of things that they do not understand, and those in authority. And he tells us that they're going to perish in their own, they're going to receive the reward of their unrighteousness. There we have the principle of sowing and reaping. Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. He that sows to the flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption. He that sows to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. Galatians 6, verse 7 and 8. Well, this is the principle now that's applied in relationship to these individuals who are brute beasts, self-willed, all of these that Peter is describing here, or their character. Now then, they are going to receive the reward of their unrighteousness. They are going to perish in their own corruption. These are counted a pleasure to riot in the daytime. And then he says that they are spots in and blemishes, sporting themselves with their own deceivings while they feast with you. They are with the brethren. They're there eating with the brethren, delighting in their sins. They have no shame, in other words, in relationship to it. They have eyes full of adultery. Literally, this is of an adulteress. Now then, notice in this, and this is an important point, because some will come along and say, well, these individuals weren't really Christians. Notice, though, that God uses terms, and when he uses a term, he uses it for a specific purpose. He says here, having eyes full, or eyes of an adulteress. He does not say eyes of a fornicator. Now, why? Well, a fornicator is dealing with one who is not married. An adulteress is one who is married. These individuals had been married to God. They were married to Christ. And thus, they were Christians. But now then, they have eyes of an adulteress. They are going away from Christianity, going and beginning to live in a way that's contrary to God, and it deals with that nature of the husband and wife relationship with Christ in the church. And that here's individuals who are members of the church, but they have forsaken their husband, Christ, to go and to worship and to be with someone else. So eyes full of an adulteress, or of an adulteress, not of a fornicator. And it shows that these were Christians. They do not cease from sin. They beguile unstable souls. So here they are, eating with brethren, delighting in their sin, and deceiving other brethren, beguiling unstable souls. They have a heart that's exercised to covetous practices. There goes back to that aspect of an adulteress. They are practicing covetousness. They have made something else their God instead of God as being their God, Jehovah God being their God. And notice that they are leading others astray, beguiling unstable souls. And that's one of the reasons when we deal with withdrawal of fellowship, one of the reasons is because we need to keep the purity of the church. It is, and that's one of the purposes of the withdrawal of fellowship, to keep the church pure. Because, and as Paul puts it in 1 Corinthians 5th chapter, a little leaven leaveneth the whole lump. And so we withdraw ourselves from those individuals who are, yes, false teachers, as well as living immoral lives. Why? Because we are wanting to keep the church pure. And if we allow them to remain within us, then they're going to influence others. They are going to beguile unstable souls. And someone will look at them and say, well, they're doing it, and if they're doing it, then it must be all right for me to do it. And so we have to withdraw from them. And certainly these that Peter was writing to should have withdrawn fellowship from these false teachers. They should have been warned and should have put them to a stop and not allowed them to come in and remain within them and eat with them while delighting in their sin and beguiling these unstable souls, influencing others. And that's what we saw even in verse 2, that many shall follow their pernicious ways. They are now beguiling unstable souls. The word they have exercised, the word exercise there literally is the word gymnastics. They are exercising themselves. They are practicing gymnastics. The word beguiling, and I think we studied this in an earlier lesson, is from the Greek word deliadzo, and it's a bait. And it's interesting, Peter is a fisherman. He uses a term here, beguiling, of a bait, a fisherman's term. But here's a bait that's thrown out there to these unstable souls to make them come out of that fold of safety and strike the bait, and then they're going to be taken. Well, that's what these individuals are doing. And thus they are cursed children. They have forsaken the right way. And you could go back to the idea of adulteress. They have forsaken the right way. The right way was the way of God. In fact, if you go back to the right way of this verse, you can also see in verse 21 that there is the way of righteousness. And earlier in the book, we would also see the aspect of way of truth in verse 2. So you have way of truth, the way of the right way, and the way of righteousness, verse 21. And thus a study of the ways in which we have in 2 Peter 2. Well, they have forsaken that right way. They have thus gone astray. And let me add this in relationship to going astray. When false teachers come in, they don't come in, we mentioned this last time, yelling, waving a red flag saying and yelling, I'm a false teacher. Instead, what they do is they come in, very slowly start drifting away. It's a slow, imperceptible drift to begin with. But it is a going astray. They do not remain within the right way. They go astray, but it's a slow, very gradual process of going astray. And the only way in which things are going to be salvaged, really, within the church today, is if we catch it early enough, at the very beginning, before it gets very far away. And if we catch it early enough, then we can put a stop to it. But once it develops, in reality, there's not going to be any saving of those individuals. They've gone too far. They become cursed children. And notice again the aspect of children there shows that these were children. They were children of God. Well, now then, they have followed the way of Balaam, the son of Bosor. What was it? Well, that's found in Numbers 22. He loved the wages of unrighteousness. Balak asked him to come and curse God's people. Balaam says no at first, but he has the desire to go. He wants the money. And so he finally goes, even though God had already instructed him not to. He goes and he tells Balak, no, I can't curse them. But then he finally tells Balak how he can get God to curse them by getting them to commit fornication with his people, and thus God would curse them. Well, why did he do it? Because he loved the wages of unrighteousness. He wanted money. And he was rebuked for his iniquity. What was it? Because of that desire for money, he went, and here's the dumb ass, as it is put in verse 16, speaking with a man's voice, telling the prophet, telling Balaam, you weren't supposed to go. The angel was going to destroy him, but the dumb ass would tell him, you're not supposed to be going, and why are you striking me? Because Balaam had gotten down and smote him because he would rear back, saving Balaam's life. There's the madness of the prophet. Why? All because he wanted money, the wages of unrighteousness. Well, these individuals are like that. They do these things to get money. Becomes the root of so much evil today. And certainly, no doubt you're thinking of 1 Timothy 6 and verse 10, for the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. And that certainly is the case even with these individuals. Now then, verse 17, these are wells without water, clouds that are carried with a tempest. So two illustrations there. What is it? They speak, but there's no substance there. And they speak great swelling words of vanity. They promise liberty in this. They allure through the lust of the flesh. And the word allure there is the word that's beguiling back in verse 14. Deliazo. They allure. They throw that bait out. What? The lust of the flesh. What is it? They're promising liberty. But in reality, they end up being slaves of sin. So here they are promising great things, but they can't deliver them. Promising liberty, but they end up being slaves of sin. Now then, verses 20 through verse 22, we have the results of apostasy. And he says, for if, after they have escaped the pollutions of the world through the knowledge of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, they are again entangled therein and overcome, the latter end is worse with them than the beginning. For it had been better for them not to have known the way of righteousness than, after they have known it, to turn from the holy commandment delivered unto them. But it has happened unto them according to the true proverb, the dog is turned to his own vomit again, and the sow that was washed to her wallowing in the mire. Here's individuals that he is going to deal with now. They were at one time lost. They were a part of the pollutions of the world. But he shows that they have been saved. Thus, here's individuals who were lost, who have escaped the pollutions of the world. Thus, they became saved. They're no longer in those pollutions of the world. They're no longer living according to the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life. They've escaped those things. They're now living faithfully to God. Notice that salvation comes by a knowledge of Christ. They have escaped the pollutions of the world through the knowledge of Christ. That's the Greek word epinosis. And if you remember when we were introducing the book, we mentioned the two words epinosis and gnosis. Gnosis is just simply knowledge. Epi, the prefix, means upon, and thus upon knowledge, and it deals with a knowledge that is applied in life. So here's individuals who have escaped the pollutions of the world by a knowledge that has been applied in life, that knowledge of Christ. So the knowledge of Christ, Christ being applied in life, it is Christ living in me, the hope of glory, Colossians 1. Or, for me to live is Christ, what Paul says in Philippians 1:21. Well, these same individuals were in that state at one time. While they were in the pollutions of the world, they've been saved. How were they saved? By knowledge of Christ, an applied knowledge of Christ, he has applied it to his life. But he succumbs to the temptation of the world and the pollutions of the world, and he is entangled therein again, and overcome. So now then, while he was in the pollutions of the world, he has escaped that pollution through the knowledge of Christ, and thus is saved. Now then, he succumbs to that temptation again. So what is his state? He's lost once again. That's the only thing that makes sense in relationship to this verse. One who is lost, he is saved, he's lost again. And thus, we see this is one of the great passages dealing with the possibility of apostasy. We can fall from grace. There's no doubt about it. And there's no way to explain this verse other than the possibility of sinning in such a way and falling away from God in such a way as to where our souls will be eternally lost, or we can apostatize. And he states here, the state of being re-lost, if I can use that term, or lost again, is worse than if they had never been saved. So you take that situation at the first. First state was lost. Second state, he was saved. Third state, now he's lost again. Now, if you take that third state, is worse than his first state. Both of them are lost. Why would it be that it is worse? Well, it could be that there's going to be a greater punishment upon him, but it also could be that he had, in having that knowledge, he would thus know what he had lost. He would have known that he could have been in heaven. He would have known that what he could have, or what he had lost, and thus certainly that memory would. And if you remember in Tartarus, as the rich man looked up into Abraham's bosom, and Abraham tells him, "Son, remember." Luke the 16th chapter. No doubt that one who was saved and then lost, or lost and saved and lost again, when he's in torment, he is going to remember. And that memory of that salvation and the joy that he could have had, the eternal life with God in heaven, is going to torment his soul throughout all eternity. And no doubt, I do believe that there are degrees of punishment. I think that one who was lost and then saved and lost again will receive a greater degree of punishment than that individual who was never known that way of righteousness. So the state of though being re-lost is worse than never having been saved. Now then, he uses two illustrations or examples that would be in reality repulsive to Jews. A dog and a pig. Both animals, to the Jews, those animals were repulsive. And he uses really even a greater repulsiveness of the illustration. A dog returning to its vomit. And if you've seen that, it almost makes you sick at your stomach. I mean, it is a sickening sight to see a dog vomit, and then he returns to his vomit and starts licking it up. Something that is truly repulsive, but would have been even more repulsive to the Jew, because the dog itself was held in contempt by them. Then you have the second illustration, a clean pig. A pig that has been cleaned up, and what does it do? It returns to the mud and gets all dirty again. And thus, something repulsive is shown in relationship to the results of apostasy. Apostasy is something that is repulsive. It should be repulsive to us. It is repulsive to God. Now then, the third chapter primarily deals with the second coming of Christ. Chapter 3, verse 1 through the first part of verse 18. And of course, verse 18 is the last verse. The last part of that is simply a conclusion with a doxology there. But he's going to deal now with the second coming of Christ. In the first 10 verses, the surety of the second coming. Chapter 3, verses 1 through 10, the surety of the second coming. And in the first two verses, verse 1 and verse 2, Peter's epistle brings to remembrance the teachings of the Lord. So Peter's epistle brings to remembrance the teachings of the Lord. Chapter 3, verses 1 and verse 2. Let's read those two verses together. This second epistle, beloved, I now write unto you, in both which I stir up your pure minds by way of remembrance, that ye may be mindful of the words which were spoken before by the holy prophets, and of the commandment of us, the apostles of the Lord and Savior. This is Peter's second letter to them. If it is the second letter to them, then there had to be a first letter. But it also shows, and again, when introducing the book, we dealt with the fact that the internal evidence of this letter is the strongest evidence of Peter's writing. And this statement is certainly one of those, that this is the second epistle that he's writing to them. And in this, he is stirring up their minds, bringing things to their remembrance. The idea of pure minds is a word which means sincere. They're sincere minds. These individuals that he's writing to were sincere. Sincerity is necessary as far as Christianity is concerned. But he wants to stir up their minds, bring things to their remembrance. Preaching, to a great extent, is simply a bringing things to people's minds, even though they know them. And we saw this earlier in the book, in chapter 1. in verse 13, or verse 12 and verse 13, that Peter says, I will not be negligent to put you always in remembrance of these things, though you know them, and be established in the present truth. Yeah, I think it need, as long as I'm in this tabernacle, to stir you up by putting you in remembrance. Well, now then he reiterates it. I'm stirring up your mind. I want to bring these things to your remembrance. You know them, and thus they were mindful. They knew the Lord's teaching. They knew that which was spoken by the prophets and the commandments of us, the apostles. Notice he's dealing with the holy prophets and the apostles. The holy prophets there were not the Old Testament prophets, but prophets of the New Testament. If you go back to 1 Corinthians 12th chapter, there are 9 miraculous or spiritual gifts that are mentioned there. Among those was the gift of prophecy. There were New Testament prophets as well as Old Testament prophets. And so these holy prophets and the apostles of Jesus Christ, and there the term apostle simply means one sent. It's used in a generic way within the Bible, simply as being one who has been sent by someone or by some group. It's also used specifically relating to the 12 that Jesus chose to be his apostles. And certainly, notice he says, and of the commandment of us, the apostles. He is placing himself as one of the apostles of Jesus Christ. Notice it is the commandments of the Lord that was given by those holy prophets and apostles. And so there again we have a statement dealing with inspiration. These things were the commandments of the Lord. God was speaking through them, the holy prophets and apostles. And Peter is now bringing to their remembrance that which he had taught them. Verse 3 and verse 4 then, scoffers of that teaching. Now then, let me go back in this. Peter's epistle brings to remembrance teachings of the Lord. He's dealing now, that which he is bringing to their remembrance is going to be about the second coming of Christ and judgment. There are now, verses 3 and 4, scoffers of that teaching. Knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lust, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. First, he says, scoffers will come. And that takes us back to chapter 2. There were false prophets among the people, even as there shall be false teachers among you. Why should we expect anything different? Well, now then, scoffers. And start out with the knowing this first. We have mentioned that. Peter's used it before in the book. Knowing this first. Here is something of primary importance. What? Scoffers are going to come in the last days. Notice the phrase, the last days. Was Peter living when he wrote this in the last days? Well, yes, he's talking about the time that he's dealing with right then. And he's saying this is the last days. Well, what was it? It was that period of time that began on Pentecost and will continue to the second coming of Christ. It is that last dispensation of time, or giving over of time. There were 3 dispensations, the patriarchal dispensation, the Mosaic dispensation, and then there's the Christian dispensation that began at Pentecost of Acts 2. And in Acts 2, Peter quotes Joel and says, this is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel in the last days. And he begins teaching at that time. The last days are beginning then, on that day, and they're going to continue till Christ comes again. And so, during that period of time, of the last days, that means from the time of Pentecost of Acts 2 all the way till Christ comes again, we're going to have those individuals who are scoffers, who make fun of, basically, spiritual matters and Christianity and the second coming of Christ. And one of the reasons is that they are walking after their own lust. Many of the individuals who promote evolution today, if you really get down to it and you get them to be honest with you, it is because they want to live according to their own lustful feelings, the lust that is within them. And they know that if the Bible is true, then the Bible condemns the type of lifestyle that they want to live. Therefore, they discard the Bible and they scoff at it, they ridicule it, and they teach this theory of evolution. Really, it's not even a theory. The best thing it can be said is it's an hypothesis of evolution. But that's the reason that they are scoffing, because they want to live according to their own lust. And so they've got to make fun of, they've got to scoff the idea that Christ is going to come. And they're going to say, well, everything continues as it has been in the past. It is the teaching of uniformitarianism in science today that the present or the past is key to the present. You look at the past because we know everything continues as it was from the beginning of the creation, except they will deny the creation. So everything continues as it has been in the past. And it is stating that God does not intervene in the affairs of man. That's uniformitarianism. It's also deism, when you get a certain aspect of it. But these are saying, you look at the past, everything today is exactly as it was in the past. Thus, why should we expect, and why do you believe that there's going to come a time in which this world's going to come to an end? And if that's the case, thus, I can live like I want to. I can do what I want to. I can live after my own lust. Verses 5 through 7 then, or verses 5 through 10, God's answer to the scoffers. So verses 5 through 10, God's answer to the scoffers. The first answer is the flood, verses 5 through 7. So chapter 3, verses 5 through 7, the flood. He says, "For this they willingly are ignorant of, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. And the heavens and the earth, which are now by the same word, are kept in store, reserved unto fire against the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men." Notice that they were willfully ignorant. It is a purposeful ignorance of certain historical facts. And this goes back to their having a desire to walk after their own lust. So because of that desire that they have to walk after their own lust, what do? They ignore certain facts. And isn't that what the evolutionist does today? He ignores many of the facts of science. He ignores the contradictions of his theory with science. Why? Because they do not want to live according to God's restrictions. And so they ignore these things. Literally, though, when we get to this word willingly, it is a word which means wishing. That is, they were wishing it to be so. They were wishing to be that the world simply continues as it always has been. The first illustration then, God used the flood to destroy the world. And our time is up for this hour, so we will start at that point next hour, and we'll take our break at this time.